During the late 1600s and even up into the early 1700s, Parliament really had no desire to directly control the colonies. They had the Navigation Acts that were in place that largely controlled the trade between the colonies and the mother country. The mercantilist policy was working. We had no desire. It was a long ways away, so the distance made it cumbersome. And this policy of salutary neglect allowed the colonial assemblies to gain a lot of power. Largely, the colonies were left to govern themselves, and the colonial assemblies used that power. They began to tax the citizens. This was seen as a perfectly acceptable and legitimate right for the colonial assemblies. And it's the French and Indian War that causes all the problems that change this salutary neglect. The French and Indian War was a 7 years war. It's very expensive. The British sent a lot of troops to the Americas, but it's a worldwide war for them, so they go into a lot of debt. And as a result of this, there are two big policies that emerge that change from the period of salutary neglect to the post-French and Indian War. The first is that the British decided that protecting the Americans is expensive and that they should really start to protect themselves. They instituted a policy known as the Proclamation of 1763, which prevented the Americans from crossing the Appalachian Mountains and settling in the territory just gained after the French and Indian War. The reason that they did this was largely financial. There's Native Americans living west of the Appalachian Mountains, and they didn't want to have to send British troops out there to defend settlers from the Native Americans. The second thing that comes as a result of this is an increase in the desire to get Americans to help pay the British debts. Now, the Americans felt that they were paying taxes legitimately to their colonial assemblies, but that because they had no representation in Parliament, that the Parliament couldn't tax them directly. They could mess with the trade relationships through things like the Navigation Acts because that's mercantilism and that's what the colonies are there for. But because they had no representation in Parliament, it was not okay for Parliament to tax them directly. Another thing that they did was start to crack down on smugglers that were trying to get around the Navigation Acts, that were trying to trade with France and Portugal and all the others. And by cracking down on the smugglers, they took those smugglers into admiralty courts, or almost like a court-martial. And that violated the idea of the jury of peers. We're going to see that as a frustration as well.